Back to the Future Trek. We are so excited to get the next 4 weeks started, and we are super excited to talk about the issue of justice and social justice, and what does Jesus have to do with social justice. Spoiler alert, everything. So over the next few weeks, we are going to talk about this theme of Back to the Future. And when I first saw this, I thought, what does Back to the Future have to do with justice?
You've got to come back with me!
Where?
Back to the future!
Over the next few weeks, we're going to look at things that took place in the past. We're going to look at stories from the Bible, and we're going to talk about how that affects us now and how that can affect our future. As we do, we're going to explore some big ideas from the past that have the potential to change the world right now and to change the world in the future. There is a passage in Luke 4 that we're going to read from, where Jesus basically teaches in the synagogue, which is the Jewish place of worship, and he announces his mission. He announces what he is here on earth to do. So let's look at Luke 4, starting in verse 14. Then Jesus, filled with the power of the Spirit, returned to Galilee, and a report about him spread through all the surrounding country. He began to teach in their synagogues and was praised by everyone. When he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him. Then he began to say to them, "This scripture today has been fulfilled in your hearing." All spoke well of him and were amazed at the gracious words that came from his mouth. So, Jesus takes this scroll that had been written 800 years in the past. This is the what is our Old Testament, what would have been Jesus's Bible, from the prophet Isaiah that had been written in the 7th or 8th centuries BC. And in the book of Isaiah, the prophet tells us about the captivity and oppression of God's people. They were enslaved by other nations, by evil empires. They experienced cruelty. They were kicked out of their homes and sent to other places to be slaves. And God's people needed to be saved. So that's what Isaiah is talking about, that God has come to free the oppressed, to set the captive free. And then Jesus comes about 800 years later and says, "Today I am fulfilling this in your hearing." So what does that mean? A lot of people thought Jesus was talking about an actual revolution, a political revolution. He was an oppressed people. The Bible was written by brown oppressed people. That's an important thing for us to remember as we're talking about social justice. And people thought that he was here to overthrow the Roman Empire that had taken over Israel. But his dream was for Israel and beyond, including us, including our ancestors and our descendants. So the oppressed need to be freed from their oppressors, and God has a plan to make things right. And he did that through Jesus. Jesus's mission was to set people free. And Jesus lived this out. He paid attention to the marginalized, the people that the religious leaders ignored because they were too poor or too sinful or too disabled or yada, yada, yada. So Jesus paid attention to those people. He cared about those people. He spent time with those people. And Jesus was a peacemaker. And peacemaker is a great word because it is an active word. You can't make something by sitting and doing nothing. Peacemaker is not avoiding conflict or being silent. Peacemaker is speaking up in the face of oppression. Peacemaker is speaking up when something is not right. Peacemaker is sometimes getting into the fray because you know that there needs to be some conflict, there needs to be something wrong that needs to be made right, it needs to be addressed. There's a quote from a book called The Book of Longings, and it said that Jesus was sometimes a peacemaker and sometimes a provocateur, meaning that sometimes he provoked, he like poked the bear and got into the mess. And I love that because I think that that's exactly what Jesus was, that being a peacemaker sometimes means you need to stir the hornet's nest because there's something not right there. So, does justice matter to God? I absolutely think so. The Bible is full of messages about God caring for the orphan, the refugee, the immigrant, the poor, the oppressed, and Jesus lived that out. What are ways that this affects us? If any of these issues kind of prick our hearts or make us angry or make us want to do something, we can ask ourselves, who is being held captive and how? Why does this concern me? Why does this concern Jesus? How can I join Jesus in helping the people affected by this and helping bring freedom to the oppressed? As we talk about this Back to the Future trek, we are going to look at, every week we're going to highlight an issue of social justice that we think relates to our lesson that week. And we want you guys to join in, participate in lots of discussion, tell us what issues you're really passionate about and how you think Jesus cares about those things. So this first week, we wanted to talk about the issue of racism and systemic racism, especially in our country. I'm going to show this sign that has been in our front window since this summer, when you can see George Floyd's name there. He was one of the first names that went on this sign. When we moved here to this neighborhood 4 years ago, there's a house a couple doors down that had a sign in the front window that said, "Stop killing Black people." And at the time, it was very timely. I think an incident had just taken place, and over the next 4 years, that sign has never come down from that window. And every time I walk through the neighborhood, it's almost like there's a new incident that has happened. There's a new name that we need to be saying who's been unjustly killed. And that makes me angry and it breaks my heart. And the fact that a sign like this is never not timely, is never not relevant to the world's news at the moment is incredibly unjust. In America, we need to address that. I would call it our corporate sin, that we have a corporate sin of white supremacy built into the fabric of our nation that has not been addressed. This directly benefits me because I financially benefited from that systemic racism. There is systemic racism in our healthcare system, in our education system, in our incarceration system, in our realty and homeowner and economy systems. Those are things that we need to address, that we need to be honest about so that we as a nation can heal and move forward. So that is one thing that we want to talk about, hear your thoughts on. What are ways that Jesus cares about the Black Lives Matter movement? What are ways that we as Christians, because of our love for Jesus, can fight systemic racism in our country? And we want to hear from you. What is important to you about that?